Hi, my name is Ray.
Hi, this is Michael.
Welcome to another episode of Ray's Economics Clue Book. Today, we'll be measuring economic performance and continuing this by talking about how we can use a GDP calculations.
Okay.
So last video we talked about the circular flow diagram, and we reached this last, more advanced version of circular flow diagram that had basically showed basically more entities: the government, households, the financial markets, the goods and services markets, the factor markets, firms, and lastly the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And so basically, and this applies to our video today because through adding, subtracting different factors, different things, we can basically use this to find how we find our GDP.
Yeah, I really think that's a VIP, graph, a very important picture, right? So we have government, household, firms, and the rest of basically foreign entity, right? There's 4 different entities, and they create transactions through different markets: factor market, goods and service exchange market, and financial markets.
Yeah.
Okay, through 3 different markets, the 4 entities that have inflows and outflows, and which basically transfers money and different goods and service, right?
Yeah.
So that creates a perfect flow chart like that, and particularly I think that's the total inflow for each entity must equals total outflow.
Yes.
Right. So and then we can see what is the GDP and how to calculate that. Okay.
And so basically GDP, the 3 words to remember is basically gross GDP, gross domestic product. Gross means total, everything. Domestic means within the country of which GDP is measured. And product, we need to stress, is final product. We don't count intermediate products or input because we don't want to count the same product or same spending twice.
Yeah. But just that's pretty interesting, straightforward. For example, we only calculate durable goods like automobiles, right?
Yes.
We don't really calculate the steel.
Yes.
Steel price, although steel is kind of like an input for the automobile.
Because if we count the steel price and the automobile price, which contains the steel price, we're counting the steel price twice.
Yes.
So there are 3 main ways to find the GDP of a country. The one way is expenditure, which is probably the most basic or known way. Basically, you add together all the expenditures within the economy that count as final goods. Your consumption, your government spending, your business firm investment spending, which does not count like input goods, just like final investments like factories, change in the value of stocks, exports, and net imports. Basically, this equals our net exports because it exports minus imports to see how much foreign markets spend on our economy. Yeah,
I think Ray just raised a very good point because the net export, right? Net export basically it's a foreign entities expenditure.
Yes.
Right, in United States markets. So basically, by this approach, we calculate expenditure from the 4 entities. In the circular flow chart.
Yes.
Okay.
And just as a reminder, net exports can be negative because foreign markets can take more from our economy than they technically spend into it.
Yeah.
And then the second way is factor incomes because from the flow chart, our main point was that total inflow was total outflow. And outflow in this case would be factor incomes, which means inflow would be total spending on final goods. So we count the outflow, we know the inflow. So factor incomes includes our incomes, our profits, and things like that we talked about in previous videos.
Yeah, the wage, salary, and so forth.
Yes, and rent. And finally, this one's value of output. So basically, it's value added from each of the main steps in the production process. And we need to stress this is net value.
It's a net product. Okay, it's a net product. So basically, we just calculate during each step of manufacturing, the different steps is the added value.
So it's a net product of each step. So for instance, if you count the products added in the primary step, then the secondary steps, we only count the net value added. We subtract the total value of the secondary step from what we just counted in the primary step.
Yes.
So we don't overcount. So here's an example using a real GDP, which is the GDP of the United States in 2009 and 2010. And in 2009, we'll use the first quarter. So here we see our GDP is around 14.2 trillion, and we see that most of it comes from consumption.
Consumption expenditure.
Yes.
Right.
And here we're going to see how the GDP be counted using our first step, the GDP by expenditure.
Yeah.
Because here we list all the expenditures. We list our consumption. Our private domestic investment, our net exports, and our government spending.
Yeah. So again, it's just the four entities,
Yes.
right? Spending in the whole economy,
Yes.
and apparently consumer spending is
the number one.
chunk.
Consumer
right?
spending is around 9.9, almost 10 trillion, which is around 70% of our GDP.
Yeah.
And most of it about 2/3 of the consumption is on services. So we see we have a large service economy.
Service industry,
Yes,
for
service,
example, like restaurant spending, right? Dining and and then we have the investment spending, which means basically you can see it's a non-residential and residential by the
and changing in private inventories,
changing the inventories and so forth. Okay.
Yes.
And then we have the government spending.
In government spending, we see around almost 2.9 trillion or so, and we see a lot of it is going towards our national defense, which is around $750 billion.
Yeah.
Which is around 1/4 of our government spending.
Yeah.
And lastly, we see net exports. Net exports we see in the United States, if you pay attention to politics, you know this is mentioned a lot. Our net export is around negative 400 billion, which is technically speaking actually not that much. But
in 2009.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so our exports are around 1.5 trillion, or imports around 1.89 trillion. And so we have a
So the next export of goods and services is a negative number, which means basically the United States import more and export less.
So technically, we are spending more on foreign markets.
Yes.
And foreign markets are technically taking more from our economy.
Sure.
They spend on it. If you
so the net effect is the foreign entities in aggregate sense, they don't really spend anything in the U.S. market.
Yes.
Okay. So they spend a negative number in aggregate.
Yes.
Yeah,
that's not necessarily. We're not saying that's necessarily good or bad. That's just the way things are.
Yeah. And so actually, we already label that, right?
C is consumption, I is investment, X or XM is net exports, and G is government spending. And here we see the four main, parts of our flow chart. We have the government, we have our household or consumption spending, we have firms investment spending, we have the rest of the world on our net exports. So here in spending we really see the four components or four people in our circular flow chart come to play in our GDP.
Yeah, so this is a pretty straightforward way. Yeah. So let's see.
So lastly, basically GDP flow chart all leads to one thing, and that is total spending equals total income, inflow equals outflow, which is a huge way we use to count GDP and a huge concept of our circular flow chart.
Yeah, I think next time we're going to discuss the two other ways, as we already just mentioned, by using the factors income and by using the value-added approach.
Yes.
Okay. So I think that's about it, and I see you guys next time.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.